Hi, everybody. Today is July 7th, 2022. This is the issue triage meeting for the Operator Framework project. We're going to start by looking at some of the issues in the RuckPack project. We'll be looking for labels that specifically state that it needs grooming. Okay. Does anybody remember what that label was? Needs grooming. There's the grooming. There we go. Okay, so we'll start with this first one. All right, so I think we spoke about this one fairly recently. It was the idea that we needed to opt out of CRD validation webhooks because of the direction of the upstream, Kubernetes ecosystem and some of them moving away from webhooks in general. We had any traction on this since our last meeting? It says moving to the next milestone so we can triage again. Okay, so right now it's been placed in the backlog. Is this something we want to move to the current milestone? Tim, can you comment on that?
Hey, sorry, what was the question? I was doing some work in the background.
All good. So there was some, there was an issue asking if we could opt out of the CRD validating webhook that we have in RuckPack. I saw that it was removed from the previous milestone and placed in the backlog. Is this something we want to move into the next milestone?
Yeah, I don't know. We might need to revisit this, given. So I think the clear alternative is it doesn't seem like upstream wants to pursue this, but maybe the short-term trade-off is we just boil this into the controller implementation. I don't know. I haven't given this a ton of thought whether it needs to be elevated out of the backlog. To answer your question. So
Okay.
if we want to create like a v0.7 tracker and just manually move it there so we're forced to groom it again, that's fine with me.
Okay, yeah, we can do that. We will change this.
But it is unclear. I mean, if the CRD validation webhook goes down, does that block all CRD events or is that only update events? Because if that is the case, then that's probably something we'll need to address even outside of the scale concerns.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure on that, Tim. That's probably something we want to address. All right, I can take a look now to see so we can get a clear answer on this if we want to come back to that.
Okay, I'm going to assign that. Sorry, I'm not going to assign it to myself. I am in fact going to assign it to Tyler. There we go. And I'm just going to add a comment. Remove myself from this. Perfect. And Tyler, I do believe that there's like I forget if there's like something that outright rejects it or not. I thought there was a way to make it so that if you're going to contact the webhook that it doesn't break the call, but
So
I'll have to
believe that the webhook, well, I don't know. On the current implementation, we have a webhook that filters out all requests for CRDs and only sends them to it, sends the CRD updates and changes to the webhook if they're owned by RuckPack. But yeah, that's I haven't seen this failure policy.
Yeah, this is what I was thinking about. So the failure policy allows how unrecognized errors from the admission endpoint are handled. So I think we usually use fail, which would be like if there's any error that we aren't expecting and it fails, it would cause, the request to fail, but we might be able to set this to default. But what we could do, we could link to this. Maybe we have non-Red Hat documentation we could point to. Let's see, failure. Yeah, so there's a failure policy. Okay, so I'm gonna just save this link and I'm gonna update this. Ticket may behoove us to investigate the ignore failure policy. We'll just very quickly add that here. Because like this. So Tim, just to be sure, the reason we were looking into this was because if the validating webhook configuration doesn't completely break everything when it's not available, that would be like a nice user experience, right?
You have the flip side problem though, right? Which is someone said, please make sure when you upgrade my CRD that I don't lose, like, it's not a data losing proposition, which is the point of this webhook, right? It's gonna do a bunch of checks that make sure that the update won't cause data loss. So then if there's a failure and we just ignore it, then we're going to update it and it will cause data loss. So now we've kind of violated that side of the expectation.
Okay,
I kind of think and maybe the original reason for this issue was I was probably bringing up like maybe this should be an opt-in thing, which is like if you want this extra validation, you have to explicitly tell us you want it. And it could be something in your CRD such that you can just always put it on every single CRD you use. And then in that case, you could leave this as failure mode fail, such that like, okay, this is failing because the webhook is down. I think this will be safe, so I'll just go and provide a patch to the CRD that says go ahead and do the update, like remove that annotation. I mean, I guess you could do it the other way around too, where you could like add the opt-out annotation. But in my mind, I think we should think very carefully about setting this to ignore errors.
Right. Is there any reason we can't package this up as its own operator that could be deployed by RUCPAC that improves CRD validation, right? Preventing those breaking validation changes? Because I think Tyler really nailed the user experience we wanted to provide with the current implementation that prevents breaking CRD changes. I think the one thing that we're kind of tripping over, like you've mentioned, is like this opt-in, opt-out mechanism. A lot of developers probably don't want to see this. A lot of like production level clusters probably do. And so making it easy to, you could use RUCPAC to install this operator, and then that operator could then handle the CRD validation and prevent the breaking changes. And that kind of seems like the best of both worlds. And we could even, if we wanted to, make it easy to immediately install that operator. And then if they don't want it installed, they could just delete the bundle instance. I think those would be what we get rid of. Is that a reasonable approach to investigate?
I think I feel good about that. If you think about RUCPAC, it doesn't necessarily have to be like deployments that, well, this would come with a deployment, but we could just deploy this webhook as a RUCPAC package or a RUCPAC bundle and bundle deployment pretty easily, as long as it has an image or some other kind of source. So that wouldn't be too difficult to do. I think it would also probably let us make the user experience a bit easier if it's like its own thing entirely and not kind of tied to being, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff that we could think about with that, but I think at a surface level, I'm okay with it being an installable versus something that always comes with RUCPAC, and then you have to specify it. I don't know.
Yeah, so in my mind, like the opt-in, opt-out decision for me, I draw a little bit from like OLM's past of like trying to change the defaults of how like the upstream Kubernetes worked, where like, we have like the tenancy model that like turned out like we thought at the time, like, okay, this is the direction everything's going, and then it turned out like that wasn't true. I waffle, right? But like I kind of feel like maybe we should go the other direction, which is we're just gonna treat this like a normal cluster by default. And if you want to update a CRD, and we'll just do the CRD update, no questions asked. If you want the extra validation that comes with, this stuff, then add those annotations that dictate what extra validation we're going to do. That way, like, if you apply a random CRD to the cluster, it behaves like you would always expect it to behave with any other Kubernetes cluster that doesn't have Ruckpack or this validator installed. But I don't know, part of the value proposition of OLM is all of these safe things that people don't understand. So it's a tough call.
I think
Yeah.
where I could be at, Joe, is I think opting in probably feels like a natural progression right now. And that's a really easy mechanically to do. There's a annotation constant that exists in the CRD validator package that we can just change, and it is going to filter on that particular annotation. It's really simple to do. I think I'm interested in the concept of I install the CRD validator bundle deployment, and now all of my CRD operations are safe. That would be interesting. And then that way it's an opt-in for an entire cluster. I think that's something that we can think through later because there's some design implications there. But for the short term, it's really simple to just solve this particular issue. As long as we're comfortable with it being opt-in, that's like a really easy, just basically one line change and some test changes, which I would be fine with. I think the hardest thing for this ticket is just coming to a point where we all feel comfortable, at least as a project, with it being opt-in. And if we are, then it's an easy fix.
Yeah, I would just say that opt-in, if we go the annotation approach, means you also have to install cert manager, right? So the nice bit about it being like a bundle thing, it could be when we do support dependencies with the DEPI, that could be immediately resolved when you opt into.
I think we have a webhook already with core bundle application for immutability. So right now, cert manager, even without this webhook, would still be a dependency of Ruckpack itself.
Okay. Okay.
So one more thing, and then I'll shut up. So it sounds like there's kind of two opt-ins, right? There's, do you want to turn on this validator? Yes or no? And then if the validator is running, do you want it to automatically apply to all CRDs by default, or just to the CRDs that have the specific annotation? So there's kind of like potentially two opt-in steps depending on how you do it, right? Or an opt-in, but then an opt-out step, right? So just another piece of this to consider.
That's the first one. And then the second one, to
While you're writing that out, Alex, another thing to consider is early on in the design stages of the CRD validator, I think we always wanted to break it out into its own thing and it be installable from Ruckpack. So it might be that we're coming up to time to address that once we kind of make progress on this front. I think it's kind of low priorities, which is why we haven't really pushed for it. But I can handle making a tracking issue for that, and we can triage that at the time that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And just to recapture some of the stuff, the specified annotation. So, Joe, you had mentioned that there were two things we needed to do here. One way to turn on the validation at all, and then one way to provide an annotation that would effectively allow you to opt in or out on each CRD that is
Right.
installed.
Yeah. While we're talking about CRD validation, I was literally just in a meeting with Kevin talking about this, but another validation we might want to think about is CRD deletion. So, there's been a lot of talk that I've, tried to kind of work in there about separating APIs from controllers, like having different bundle types. But one way to solve that might be to just say, if you have a CRD deletion validation webhook, that before you allow deletion of a CRD, it checks to make sure that there are no instances of the CR associated with it. So that you effectively force users that want to delete a CRD to explicitly go and delete all of the CRDs first, or the CRs first. Which that might be yet another, like in my mind, I kind of think of like CRDs maybe having like different validation annotations. So like one for schema tightening or whatever, and one for the conversion webhook stuff, and then another maybe for this deletion thing, such that you could selectively opt in or out to these various things that we want to check related to CRDs. So anyway, I don't think it's directly related to this issue because this is mainly about the validation of like the schema validation piece of it, but it's semi-related just because we have a webhook already that implements the validation of CRD requests. So I don't know if we want to capture that or not.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to track. We can immediately follow up with this and capture that issue as soon as I finish this comment, and then I think that, or you can submit it yourself.
Yeah, I can do it as a follow-up.
Okay, and just one last comment on this. I don't think pursuing option 1 excludes us from eventually pursuing option 2. I think, having the ability to opt in and out of a webhook is probably something we want, even if the webhook gets shipped as its own bundle later on, right? So I think, if we're going to prioritize work, we probably do this one first, and that provides people with an opt-in, opt-out. Well, I guess this is actually separate, but like this bullet point, the second one, is like defining an annotation that allows you to opt in and opt out of the validating webhook is probably useful, even if it's shipped as its own thing. Whereas this thing is kind of just it is either a short-term solution before we do number 2, or it's its own solution. We don't pursue number 2. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. That's how I see it. It also saves on resources on the cluster. It's just another deployment that you don't need if you're not using it. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. Cool. Okay, I'm going to comment then.
The only other addition I would have to that, Alex, is that if we put it in core Ruckpack at any point and then we decide to take it out and separate it, we'll have built the assumption that like if Ruckpack is installed, that validating webhook is installed. So just something to think about in terms of, I don't think it matters at this point because we're still in kind of tech preview, alpha mode, and we can make whatever breaking changes we need to, but longer term, like that would be a breaking change if we all of a sudden said like, oh, now this validating webhook is optionally installed, you have to go and do it separate.
Yeah, I agree. But still, as long as we have the bundle and bundle instance, that we can still package it as the second one, and then we can move towards separating them in a major
That's
release.
true. Yeah.
So, yeah. So, and then I'll add a comment there. Just add some notes. Okay.
Sorry, I was wrangling with Jira. So it sounds like we're making this opt-in. Or did I mishear that conversation?
So we are moving towards an opt-in model. We are undecided whether or not we want to move this to a separate, to its own bundle. That's something that Tyler is going to look into. Adding this annotation, I think, is something we do want to provide no matter what. Opt-in, opt-out of the validating webhook is useful in either scenario. So we can go ahead and do that no matter what. And then we need to consider that when RuckPack validate is promoted to a V1 version, if the webhook is there, we can't just remove it without doing another major release.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe something to shore up when we look at beta level requirements.
Sorry, what was that last bit, Tim? You cut out for me.
I'm not too sure. Sometimes Zoom, my mic goes crazy, but I was saying maybe it's just something to identify as something to shore up when we mark it as beta or beta GA kind of thing.
Yeah. I'm gonna add this comment. Cool. Joe, do you want me just to make that issue now that you had mentioned? I don't think it'll take too long.
Alex, I can do it myself later. No big deal.
Okay.
Actually, I'm kind of working on it in the background right now.
Perfect. Love that. Okay. Label needs grooming.
One quick note. I don't know if we heavily use the needs grooming label for RuckPack. I think the ones that usually don't have a priority or a milestone might be worth chasing, but oh wow, it looks like there's a couple now. I don't know if that's worth trying to slot in the meantime.
I think this makes, I'm fine doing this. What we should do, maybe, okay, I'm just going to propose something from now on. Whenever we go in and we see that an issue doesn't have a priority, we triage those first at these meetings. Is that acceptable? Any complaints? Okay, we're gonna just we're gonna assume that's fine then. Okay. Wrap this update call in a retry that ignores conflict errors. Okay, so who submitted this?
I don't think Dan's here, but I think Dan recently added local bundle. So pretty much config map in this context, support for RuckPack. I didn't review that PR, so this looks like net new code. So I'm guessing it's from that.
Okay, I see. Yeah, this is actually really nice. The to-do that was written generates an issue.
Yeah, we have a CI thing. Whenever you merge code, it does that.
This is cool. Okay. It'd be great if Dan was here, but what we can do to wrap this call on that
Yeah,
ignores.
I don't know if that's the to do. Maybe it's just using patch like server side apply instead of update, but because do we need retry logic if it's a reconciliation loop? Wouldn't we just retry anyways? I mean, we'd perform, I guess, some unnecessary work, but wrapping this in an update call might seem.
I personally get concerned wrapping this in a loop because unless, I don't know how RuckPack is set up, but it doesn't allow multiple reconcile functions to be running at the same time. There's a way to increase, I think, the number of times that, or the number that can run in parallel. So depending on the weight that we add, new events can't get processed. So
yeah, that's a good point. I wonder if it's worth just tagging Dan in a comment, Alex, and moving this to the backlog and trying to get clarification from him.
Yeah, so what so what I'm going to do
That's what I'm thinking too, Tim.
Reviewed. Sorry, what is the term I'm looking for? It's like a, like a result in a, it gets stuck. What is the term I'm looking for?
Talking about deadlock?
It's basically a deadlock, but it's not a deadlock necessarily. It's just it would just wait until the timer runs out, right? Like it wouldn't get stuck indefinitely. So retop could, I'm just going to say, prevent other events from being filed.
You're talking about the back off limit, basically.
Well, specifically the, you update it, it would go into this. Let's say we had a retry. We tried retries. We implemented retries here and we said wait 10 seconds. That means that you would, for each event that's in it, like let's say we made 20 events, the first event would go and it would wait 10 seconds, and then the next event would go, it would take 10 seconds. So by the 20th event, you're looking at like 200 seconds that pass by or so before the event can be reconciled by the controller, right? So my concern is that if the retry, like lots of our, I don't want the retry to run for a duration of seconds if we do implement this, like because it could cause the event queue to pile up. Does that make sense? Like if it's just a second call, sure, but I don't want it to.
So one problem with doing this retry on conflict thing is that you may end up writing a status that is actually out of date, right? Like the whole reason you get a conflict is because some other controller has more recently updated the status than the last time you saw the spec for this.
Mm-hmm.
So generally it seems like the right thing to do is say like, well, I guess I need to re-reconcile and get like the latest state and then compute a new status from that. But what would actually happen is if you did the retry on conflict is you would just forcefully overwrite the status with this current status, even if it's not actually up to date, if that makes sense. So in my mind, while the users might complain because it makes the logs noisy, the right answer is to just return the conflict error from the reconciliation loop, which causes a retry to happen on a back off. And eventually then the cache will be updated such that you have the latest state. I guess the problem is like if you have two competing controllers that are constantly reconciling as a result of the other's change, then like you build like this, infinite loop kind of thing, but that seems like a separate bug.
Yeah, those controllers should, if they're deployed on the same cluster, either they shouldn't be deployed on the same cluster or they need to be updated to work together, right?
Right.
So I think this covers most of it. And we've raised our concern. We're like, okay, we probably shouldn't retry updates. And I'm gonna give Dan an opportunity to explain why we should retry. Why it makes sense to retry, and because Dan might have a valid reason for doing it, eh? So I think I want to give him an opportunity to share why.
It might be nice. So I again, like I think like there's tons of people that look at OLM logs today and say, what are all these conflicts there? Something is wrong. And the answer is like, well, actually, there's not really anything wrong. Like that's just what happens when you have a system where multiple riders are going on. So maybe the answer to that is like, well, maybe we should explicitly check that update error. And if it's a conflict error, then maybe you could log that at like the first debug level and then return with requeue true rather than nil error. Then like you're getting the requeue behavior that you want, but you're only logging the conflict at a like a slightly higher verbosity. And typical usages wouldn't see that error, but the right behavior is still happening in the background. The downside of that is if you're seeing some weird behavior where the status doesn't get updated, you have to know to go turn up the verbosity on your controller logs to figure out why. But I think that's generally a step that most people know to take. So maybe it's not that bad.
Okay. That captures what you were recommending, eh? Log the error
Yep.
at the debug.
That last thing you could probably put with a nil error. That the error is what causes controller runtime to produce that huge backtrace, which scares people.
Okay. I think that captures it all, eh? Yeah, so I agree with you, Joe. I think in general, whenever a controller is being written, unless you have a very, very good reason, you probably shouldn't log anything at info level just because they are such long-lived resources, and it's usually better practice to write to the status if a specific CR is having an issue. But I do think, writing in debug makes a ton of sense all the time whenever there's a specific thing you want to call out that seems pretty important when you hit an issue.
Yeah, and yeah, I would agree. In this case, like we tried to update the status and it failed on a conflict, so we couldn't. So it's like, well, I can't know for sure that I can update the status with this conflict error because everything else in the status might be wrong. So I think the only thing you can do on this conflict is log something and try again.
Oh, that's a very good point, because you wouldn't want to update the status because you have an outdated version. Yeah.
Right.
See, Joe, this is why I like talking with you. I get smarter. Cool. I'm gonna do that. Oh, I need to label this. So priority. This is probably a Lordy. Priority backlog.
I think we've just been using the important star, so important soon, important long term.
Okay, we can do that. Thank you. And then the milestone, I'm just going to throw this in the backlog. This is actually probably a good first issue too. It's not too complicated. I'm going to add that label too. Okay. Do we use projects at all? That's every issue.
maybe for Deppy.
Should you remove the to-do label while you're at it?
Absolutely brilliant call. Boom. Okay. Investigate UX parent for bundle that has valid bundle type. Tim, this is something you threw.
This is probably like hacking on something in the weekend. Oh yeah, I remember this. This is for some like Rec Pack Plus stuff. I think what I noticed was that I tried to create an invalid bundle, and that bundle failed to unpack given it was a plain bundle format and it used nested directories. So the unpacker component complained about that, and we complained about it in the bundle resource, but the bundle deployment that was managing that bundle didn't reflect that. So I had to dive deeper into what that was happening. So That felt like the wrong user experience. I'd prefer just to interface with a single API, and given the bundle deployment is kind of that API right now, it felt like a reasonable thing to suggest we should be propagating that underlying bundle status when it fails to unpack to the bundle deployment. Sorry, it's becoming a bit wordy, but so that's one step. And I guess one other alternative is like, does the printer column UX need to be refactored? And I think we already know it does, but reflecting the unpack state might be something we're chasing. I don't know. That's probably the domain that's least worth talking about, though. I'm more considerate about the propagating to the bundle deployment.
This sounds a lot similar, or very similar to that one issue that we've had for a while. We talked about it a couple of meetings ago around readdressing, I think it was like bundle deployment UX or something like that. Yeah, bundle instance. So this is I'm gonna link it in chat. This sounds pretty similar. It definitely has some overlap. Maybe we bundle this into that and close this as like a duplicate. I don't know if they're entirely similar, Tim, but what are your thoughts?
That one's much more of an API. I'm much more. I think we'll start seeing this when we start building out Deputy Plus, where we're kind of delegating a lot of this to RucPack, and we might have clients parsing status condition types, which I don't know if is a anti-pattern, but it seemed reasonable in my head. In which case, we would need to properly relay that information. So this issue, and maybe it needs to be renamed, was just about bundles that fail to unpack should surface the reason why it failed.
Gotcha. Do you think that's something that I think there was another issue. I would have to find it, but we were talking about removing has valid bundle or something like that. Is there maybe just like an overhaul we need of our printer columns and how we communicate status in general?
Yeah, maybe, but that seems like a larger effort than some of these edge cases.
Yeah, I'm fine with kind of like shoring up some of the issues we have with our current implementation. I'm wondering if this is indicative of a larger conversation we need to have. But for this particular issue, I mean, I'm fine. I think I agree with it. Surfacing that has valid bundle would help a lot with UX. May even help with other issues that we have open around this particular space. So I'm fine with this going through.
Okay, so I am going to. This seems priority. Where's my?
I think we've typically prioritized UX issues, so maybe important soon and throwing in the next milestone.
Yeah, I think
Seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, I think, in the interest of creating a single interface for people, if you update a resource and if you create a bundle deployment and that fails, I think it makes sense to reflect that in the resource that the user interacted with. They shouldn't have to look somewhere else and be surprised. So I think that is an important UX, and I think it should be delivered. So this is a great issue. Thank you, Tim. Okay. Oh, look at that. Joe opened an issue in RucPack.
So I can explain this really quick if you want me to.
Go for it.
So this is the one I was just talking about in the CRD validation, which is what happens if you delete a bundle deployment that has CRDs, that has CRs. So in like the base case, you create a bundle deployment that installs some CRDs, you start interacting with the API and you've got some CRs. You go and delete the bundle deployment and that deletes the CRDs, which deletes the CRs. So it's like, okay, that kind of makes sense. You were kind of on both sides of the install, uninstall thing, maybe you had some awareness that uninstalling the bundle deployment would cause the rest of that to cascade. Maybe that's fine. The worst, but maybe it's not, right? Like you might not know that deleting the bundle deployment will delete the CRDs, especially if you're an existing user of OLM, because right now, like the uninstall doesn't actually delete the CRDs, and uninstall is a little bit nebulous. So in RuckPack, we're drawing a harder line and basically saying like the CRDs are owned by the bundle deployment, and if you delete the bundle deployment, garbage collection will clean up the CRDs, and because CRs are garbage collected when CRDs are gone, like it cascades. So it's a little bit problematic. The even bigger problem is in the case where we have dependency resolution happening. So if operator A depends on operator B, and someone says, okay, install operator A, then what's going to happen is you're going to get operators A and B on the cluster. And then, you know, the first user that said they wanted A starts using A's APIs. And then maybe a month later, someone else comes along and says like, oh, I'm glad operator B's APIs are here. I'm going to start using those. Not really aware of how operator B got there, right? Like it's just there, they're using it. And then later, cluster user one says like, oh, I don't need operator A anymore, like get rid of it. And then the same thing happens, right? Like the resolution will say like, okay, you don't want operator A, and because operator B is only here because operator A depended on it, I don't need operator B anymore either. So go and delete those bundle deployments. Now that second user is like, well, wait a sec, like what happened? I was using my B APIs just a second ago and now they're gone. WTF. So there's a couple of solutions, right? The obvious solution is kind of what I put in the title, which is if we just block CRD deletion on the CRs not being there, cluster user two, like, well, cluster user one who tried to say like, I don't need operator A anymore. That garbage collection would basically halt on the CRD deletion because it would get a validating webhook result that said like, can't delete the CRD because these CRs exist. And then that would be a hint to cluster user one, like, well, what are these other operator B CRs that exist over here? You know, now I've got to go figure out what's going on. And then at that point, you might say like, okay, well, let me add a new constraint to the cluster that says just make sure operator B is still installed because cluster user two is using it. So I think we probably need something like this because there's going to be situations if we do this cascading CRD CR delete where stuff just disappears that people aren't expecting to disappear. Yeah, so that's the elevator pitch.
This is interesting because it doesn't actually stop RuckPack from deleting the bundle, right? So the operator B bundle in this case, as far as I can tell, it just stops operator B's CRD from being deleted. So you can still, this would effectively, before the new constraint is introduced for operator B, what we would see is basically the experience you get with OLM today, where the CRD is still present, the operator is gone, and none of the resources are reconciled, right?
Yeah, so if we don't change anything else, the bundle deployment would get the operator B bundle deployment would get a deletion timestamp, and it would basically block because I guess it would depend on how we set up the owner references, but theoretically, like that bundle deployment would just stay there permanently until you got rid of the other CRDs, which maybe that's not good either because you might want to actually let that deletion progress. The other option, I guess, is you could maybe have something at the bundle deployment validation that somehow ties things down to the CRD and does the same sort of check, right? Like you could probably discover all the CRDs owned by a bundle deployment and then look to see if any of those CRDs have any CRs and then block the whole bundle deployment from being deleted.
You could do a dry run against the CRD being deleted. And then fail the bundle deployment or
yeah,
whatever, right? or prevent it from deleting it. So maybe we capture this one point, and then we send this off to someone. It's an interesting. I kind of took it because we have a hack day tomorrow, and I thought this would be interesting. And I could kind of just copy the existing validating webhook, or I could even just change the existing one in like my own branch to do this and just delete its current implementation. That way I don't have to do I don't have to spin up all the
Yeah, I think
resources.
I kind of imagine that we would just add this to the existing CRD validator webhook. So yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
But that's a good point, Alex. There's lots of things to figure out in terms of the workflow of where things get deleted, what's allowed to get deleted, what's not allowed to get deleted, and then how does that impact like the larger flow of how the rest of the system expects things to work. So maybe doing this only at the CRD level would cause other problems.
Yeah. So quick question. So bundle deployment, that's the resource that is that's the owner reference resource, right?
The CRD will have an owner reference that points to the bundle deployment. Yeah.
This does feel like it's potentially going against the what you see is what you get nature of RuckBack. That feels like it's been emerging, but I guess that's kind of like combed out if CRD validation becomes opt-in.
Yeah, like in my mind, this is just yet another foot gun around data loss that people are unaware of potentially with CRDs, right? So in my mind, this is a lot like updating a CRD and losing all the CR data from that because the schema is totally different.
Do we have an idea of how we'd like communicate this? Are we firing events? I mean, certainly alerting seems like overkill here, but it'd be nice to say, oh, we can't delete this because there's some status present or an event.
Well, I think like the obvious naive answer to that question is like if you're operating at the CRD level and you try to delete a CRD, you'll just get like a 400 or whatever, not authorized, or I don't remember what the error is, but basically like that just won't work. The harder part is, okay, if you delete the thing that owns the CRD, then how does that manifest? And that's what I think Alex was getting at. So that part we'd have to, I think there's some rough edges around my suggestion that we'd have to work out. But I think to answer your question, Tim, I think the ideal UX would be that like whatever request you make that would result in that CRD being deleted would just be blocked. I think it's probably going to be hard to do that as you cross the resolution gap because like you'd have to do a full resolution to know what the new resolve set bundle is going to be before you try to activate it. But yeah, something to think about.
Yeah, it almost so I echo that. I think that the goal of RuckBack is to take something and apply it to the cluster. I think this might be something that needs to be done a layer up effectively before the set of bundles and bundle deployments that are RuckBack is managing are modified, right? That way RuckBack can still stay very, very focused, but we can still introduce this safeguard against the real scenario that Joe listed here. I don't know, like obviously this would require some architecting to design, but I think the first step is just making this validating webhook and seeing what that experience is, or deciding if we even need to do that. But I'll try and dig into this tomorrow, because I don't think we're going to get to the end of that within 3 minutes.
I mean, we could. How do you know?
I suppose that's true. Tim, what's your solution?
Let's punt this to the next session.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw this. I'm marking this as a critical urgent issue because I do think it's really important. Considering this, largely this becomes more important once we introduce things like DEPI, which will add or remove bundles automatically based on constraints. And I think, Joe, that's really where this scenario really starts to pop up, eh?
Yeah, that's where it gets worse for sure.
And so I think that means we need to think about how, personally, I think that we want to handle this outside of possibly RecPack, because RecPack, I think I'm a big guy. I like really small APIs with controllers, and I think just installing something, from a bundle is like really powerful on its own. And it's just the act of figuring out how do we manage the creation of those bundle deployments and bundles, right? That's my vibe. But there are much smarter people in this call that might have different calls. So maybe if
So
you
one
have
other. Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to say, if you have an opinion, please write to the ticket. Yeah, I think we should resolve these things in living documents, more so than any other form.
Yeah, I'll put this in the doc. The other little tidbit for you, if you're looking at this tomorrow, is that the deletion is a Helm uninstall, and you might actually be saved by the Helm uninstall, and if the uninstall fails, roll back logic. So it'll be interesting. I'm interested to see what you uncover tomorrow, because it might actually work, but it might not. So we'll see.
Oh yeah, and then one last thing that we could do, we could just create a valid, validating webhook configuration that like targets the bundle resource, and when they attempt to apply it, reject it because we're like, oh yeah, that would work, wouldn't it? Whatever calls the deletion for the bundle deployments, if we just block the delete based on whether or not the bundle had a CRD that had CRs on cluster.
Yeah, I think that would work. That kind of, if you have a resolve set bundle, like that just then bubbles up to the next higher level thing that like, okay, now we're going to be able to successfully delete the resolve set bundle, but then that's going to cascade and say like, well, I couldn't delete this one bundle instance. So it almost seems like you might want to have like some sort of recursive thing that looks through the chain, the owner ref chain, or the tree really is what it would be, to see if anything below me has a CRD, and if so, then block. But that starts to get ugly, so maybe you can't do that.
Yeah, I'll play around with it and kind of get a feel for it tomorrow, and I'll update the ticket. Sorry, everybody, that we didn't get through too many tickets. We are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to end the meeting now. Unless anybody wants to share some closing thoughts on this before we end for the day. Gone. Okay, cool. So please, everybody, thank you for being here. Really appreciated the conversation that we had. I think it was useful, and we'll try and get through some more issues at our next triage meeting. All right.